Welcome to episode 3 of Real Health Radio.
Welcome to Real Health Radio. Health advice that's more than just about how you look. And here's your host, Chris Sandel.
So welcome to today's episode of the podcast, and today is going to be the first show where it's just me on my own and I'm just talking about a particular topic. And the topic today is going to be on understanding blood sugar. And I wanted to do this topic for a couple of reasons. So the first one is there's just so much misunderstanding about sort of carbohydrates and blood sugar and just a lot of fear and sort of paranoia around this topic. And I know the whole kind of low carb thing's been going on for the last sort of 10 years. And this has sort of really skewed people's understanding and view of the area. And so I just really want people to kind of understand what these terms and what things really mean, because I don't think people properly grasp it. And if I'm thinking about it sort of more specifically, what kind of really prompted me to do this was I had a recent client who has just been diagnosed with sort of insulin resistance, and she's been put on sort of lots of medication. And I was chatting with her about it and just saying, okay, well, you explain to me what you know, you explain to me sort of what you think the medication's doing, etc. And she kind of really didn't understand the process particularly well. And what she did know was kind of sort of half truths and not really the whole story. So what I wanted to do is just I want to get this information out there. I want to explain sort of my take on this and why I think the common view that most people hold is not so correct. So to start with, let me give you sort of the normal explanation I think that most people have around sort of blood sugar and sort of what's going on in terms of high blood sugar and all of that. So to start with, you kind of eat carbohydrates, and those carbohydrates, they then get broken down into simple sugars. And these simple sugars, then they make it way into your bloodstream. And you then produce a hormone called insulin, and this hormone then helps the sugar that is then in your blood to move into your cells. And when your sugar then gets into the cells, it can then be converted into energy. It converts into a thing called ATP, which is cellular energy. And this energy is then used to power everything in your body. So for you to kind of run and think, but also to run your various systems. And in terms of the way that most people talk about it is when you have too high blood sugars, it's because you've been eating too much sugar, you've been eating too much carbohydrates, and also it's because insulin's not working. So insulin's not doing its job of shuttling that sugar from your blood into your cells. And the way that most people kind of think about it is they see that the problem is with the high blood sugar. And if you can just get the blood sugar under control, that everything is going to be fine. So for some people, that means that they need to inject insulin if it's got that far along. For others, it's getting them to use certain drugs, and these drugs then sort of slow sort of carbohydrates getting into the bloodstream, so thereby kind of limiting how much that blood sugar is going to increase. Other drugs kind of look at sort of preventing carbohydrate digestion. So when people eat carbohydrates, they're not able to actually digest and break that stuff down. So it really just kind of passes it straight through your digestive system without being turned into energy and out being used. So kind of using these methods to really keep blood sugar under control. In terms of diet, it's normally recommended that people go on either a low GI diet, and GI is sort of glycemic index, and these are foods that have been shown to kind of cause the lowest spike in blood sugar in the short term. So people are told that they should be eating those kind of low GI foods, or going on a sort of a low carbohydrate diet. And so carbohydrates are the things that are typically kind of breaking down into those sugars, getting into the blood and increasing that blood sugar. So why not just go on a low carb diet so that it can then lower the blood sugars and therefore sort of repairing the situation? There's also then sort of suggestions around sort of exercise and that people should be doing more exercise because this can sort of increase insulin sensitivity, and this is because sort of your muscles use glucose and use energy, and so by doing exercise it increases insulin sensitivity and actually can start to repair that situation. So that's kind of the traditional perspective on things and sort of where they kind of view things being a problem and what needs to be done. My big gripe, and the thing that I think is kind of missed as part of this sort of explanation, is that the big problem or the big focus as part of this is on blood sugar, i.e. if we can get blood sugar down and get blood sugar down really by whatever means, it is then going to repair the problem. But from my perspective, the issue isn't about the blood sugar, it is a symptom. The real issue is that the cell's inability to produce energy. Because if the cell's not able to produce energy, that's where there's the real issue. So to get into this, I'm going to explain sort of how cells produce energy. And this is kind of slightly technical, but I promise I'm going to make it as simple for you as possible. And I need to kind of go through this so you can then sort of understand sort of where I'm coming from and why I think that it's missing the point when the focus is so much on the blood sugar and not actually how cells work. So with cellular energy production, so as I said, you need to move those sugars into your cells so that they can then make energy from those sugars. It's not energy until it kind of gets into your cells where it can be then turned into it. So as part of this, you really have two stages of energy production. Stage one is known as glycolysis or fermentation. And please forget about these kind of big words. And I'm going to try and stop or not use kind of big words, but that's what it's known as. And this is the most basic form of creating energy. And so before we were humans, when we were kind of just simple single cell organisms, this way of kind of producing energy through fermentation was how we produced all of our energy. And the way that this works is you produce energy without oxygen being involved. So you take that carbohydrates, it goes into the cells, you produce a thing called ATP, which is cellular energy. And at the same time, you produce another substance called lactic acid. And so most people know of lactic acid from exercise. And the reason that you produce lactic acid from exercise is it's energy you produce when there is no oxygen there. And when someone's doing intense exercise and they're out of breath and there's not enough sort of oxygen making its way to your muscles, you're then going to be producing much more of your energy without oxygen. So you're going to be using this sort of stage one fermentation process. And it means you're then producing much more energy and then lactic acid at the same time. So that's how this fits in. The second stage of energy production is actually when you have oxygen present. And this is where we produce most of our energy, and we should be producing most of our energy. This is how we've adapted and being able to change from being something like a single cell or very simple organism to being the human bodies that we are, because we need much more energy for that to be done. And this second stage is how that process really works. So there's lots of steps as part of this second process, and it can be very convoluted and confusing, and I'm not going to go through all of that. But what I will say is that as part of this process, you produce ATP the same way as you do with glycolysis, but just a lot more. But rather than then producing lactic acid at the same time, with this you produce carbon dioxide and water and heat. And this is why if someone's cells are working well, if someone's got a kind of good metabolism, if things are working as they should be, people are warmer. Because at the same time as you're producing energy, you're also producing heat. So basically, to kind of recap, in stage one, when you produce ATP, you produce lactate or lactic acid. In stage two, when you produce energy, you produce carbon dioxide, water, and heat. Just as a kind of interesting side note, when cells become damaged, they can actually start to produce lactic acid instead of sort of carbon dioxide and water and heat, even in the presence of oxygen. So even in that kind of what should be stage two, they're still producing lactic acid. And this is actually what often happens in cancer cells. And this was demonstrated by a Nobel Prize winner called Albert Szent-Györgyi. And in this state, cells use a whole lot of energy, but they're not actually being able to produce it into proper cellular energy very effectively. And this is kind of where the idea of sugar feeds cancer comes from. And it's not really the whole story, and just kind of removing sugar from the diet doesn't repair it. But like, I'm kind of getting off track, and that's like for a whole other podcast. But let me just kind of focus now on sort of carbon dioxide for a second, because it's hugely important. And most of us know of carbon dioxide as this kind of waste product. We breathe out carbon dioxide so we can breathe in oxygen. Most people know of it as like just, it's not that important, but really it is very important. And carbon dioxide is crucial for proper cell functioning. It helps to balance electrolytes. It's very anti-inflammatory. It inhibits stress. It supports the immune system. It supports liver function. But most importantly, it also helps your cells to take up and to use oxygen, because it's actually the carbon dioxide that allows the oxygen to come into the cell and for those things to be exchanged. So without carbon dioxide, or adequate carbon dioxide, oxygen can't make its way into the cells. And this second process, or the second stage of producing energy, is also known as cellular respiration. And the same way as we breathe in oxygen and breathe out carbon dioxide, our cells do the same thing. And for our cells to produce adequate energy, for things to work really well, there has to be that good amount of carbon dioxide for that exchange to go, kind of exchange process between carbon dioxide and energy to work. So I know that little section was maybe a little bit heavy in terms of talking about things in detail, but that's how your cells produce energy. And I really think it's necessary to understand that, to show why I think kind of the beliefs that most people have around sort of balancing blood sugars and insulin resistance and diabetes is not so correct. Because really the problem isn't about high blood sugar, it's the symptom. The real problem is that at a cellular level, you're not able to produce energy effectively. There's not enough energy being produced to really run the body. And regardless of what is happening with sort of body weight, and if people are putting on weight or losing weight, energy is not making its way into the cell, or if it is making its way into the cell, it's not being able to be turned into energy effectively. And stress is a big part of this. And not really in the way that most people think about stress. And most people, when they think about stress, it's like, oh, I'm kind of working really long hours, or I'm having problems in my marriage at home, or I don't know how I'm going to pay the bills, or that kind of thing. When I'm talking about stress in this situation, I'm very much looking at the physiological changes and the stress process within the body. And while stress can have lots of different functions in the body, one of its main functions is energy regulation. Stress and the whole process of stress is about finding energy to bring to your cells to be able to mediate that process. So what happens is, when that stress response is turned on, you produce and release a hormone called adrenaline, and you release a hormone called cortisol. And adrenaline helps to break down fat so it can be turned into energy, and cortisol helps to break down protein so it can be turned into energy. And both of these are very catabolic. So basically, they are breaking down your body so it can meet your short-term stress. And so when that happens, you're breaking down these things, and then that stuff is then coming into your blood, and it's then increasing the sugars that you have in the blood. And so then in that kind of a situation, the higher blood sugar isn't necessarily coming from the diet as much as actually the body is kind of breaking itself down and having to increase those blood sugars. And to kind of give you a kind of understanding of this is, when people talk about having a hypo, so a lot of people are like, oh, I had a real kind of low blood sugar, I felt dizzy, I'd gone too long between my meals. For most people, if they actually took their blood sugar at that time, they would find that it is either normal or it's even elevated. So why is this happening? Why do people think that they're having a hypo blood sugar, in terms of hypo meaning low, but actually that's not what's going on? And the reason for that is the lack of kind of energy is going on at the cell level. It's not about what's going on in terms of blood sugar in this instance. It's about what's actually happening at the cell level. So there's not enough sugar or energy at the cell level. Your body then turns on that stress response. You start to notice you're feeling dizzy or not feeling so great. While that's going on, you're breaking things down. That's making its way into your bloodstream. And so your blood sugars are now increasing. But if that sugar is then not making its way into the cells where it's actually really needed to then be turned into proper energy, then you're going to still have a problem. So the issue with this is that the insulin, which is the hormone that is meant to be helping to shuttle that sugar into the cells, isn't working effectively. Or if it is, your energy production at the cell level is not working properly. So if we look at something like lactic acid, and remember, this is a byproduct that is produced as part of stage 1 energy production. So in that very simple way of producing energy. Well, what you actually find when you look at people who have got insulin resistance, when you look at people who've got diabetes, they will actually have higher amounts of lactic acid and have higher amounts of or lactate. And what this shows is that they're not producing energy very effectively because that kind of early stage 1 of producing energy is not so effective. But what it's also showing is that actually sugar is making its way into the cells and it's just not then being used effectively and produced effectively. So often when people talk about insulin resistance, it's talked about as if it's the insulin, it's not shuttling it into the cells that's causing a problem. And that can be part of it. But often what's happening is it is actually being pushed into the cells, but they're not able to create energy effectively. And so you then get a situation, they're not able to create energy effectively. Your body continues to go that stress response. It's then breaking down and putting more stuff into your blood sugars. So your blood sugars are continuing to go up. Some of the stuff's getting into your cells, but you're not able to produce energy effectively. You can also have a situation, as I described before, where cells get back to that very primitive stage, where even when you're getting into that second stage, they're just not able to produce the carbon dioxide, the water, and the heat, and instead they're just producing lactic acid in the presence of oxygen. So what this hopefully sort of demonstrates is that the idea of insulin insensitivity might not be sort of the whole problem. And it's typically sort of the way it's explained is that it's because insulin is not working properly and sugar's not getting into the cells. Well, if people are having then high amounts of lactic acid or lactate, it would indicate that sugar is getting into the cells. It's just not being converted into energy properly. And so if we look at sort of insulin for a minute, because this is what's often blamed for what's going on. And I know a lot within the sort of low-carb community sort of blame the fact that it's all insulin's fault. A lot of doctors and a lot of sort of writing around diabetes is all about sort of the problems with having a high insulin. And what typically happens, if you eat a normal meal, after eating that meal, your insulin will increase. And it should increase because it's what helps your cells then get that energy. So the real issue isn't with high amounts of insulin, it's high amounts of insulin when it's all the time. So not the fact that it goes up after a meal, that's a normal process. It's when it's having all the time. But I would still even add to that, it's not that the high insulin, if it's happening all the time, is the actual cause. It's just a symptom of what's going on. The high insulin is happening because insulin's not doing its job effectively. It's not being able to get sugar into the cells, or the cells aren't able to produce energy effectively. So the body's still keeping that insulin high so that it can help with that process, but it's just not working. So the high insulin's not the problem. It's again just a symptom of what's going on. And so the suggestion often, as I kind of mentioned at the beginning, is that people need to be going on sort of a low-carb diet, or they need to be sort of switching their diet so they're using sort of more fat as their energy source because carbs are a problem for them. And the problem with this is that it really doesn't kind of solve the issue. And when you look at the way that cells are functioning and the body's functioning for these kind of people anyway, they're actually using a hell of a lot of fat anyway as their energy source. And normally they're releasing much more fat from their cells, and they're actually using much more as an energy source. Because when cells can't get enough energy from carbohydrates, as I said, they turn on adrenaline, they turn on cortisol, and that turning on adrenaline starts to liberate that fat and uses it more for energy. And what happens as part of that process is the more the body starts to use fat as that energy source, the more that it continues to want to use fat as that energy source and will actually block sugar getting into the cells, causing or further making the kind of insulin resistance or diabetes a problem. And this is actually known as the PJ Randall effect. And basically, the problem as part of this is you're just not producing much in the way of carbon dioxide as well. And so this further makes it an issue. So what about sugar? I know kind of people talk about sort of, well, it's all sugar's fault. If we just kind of didn't eat sugar, then no one would have an issue. Well, kind of diabetes mellitus, originally, if you look at what the word means, it kind of derives from kind of sweet urine. And this is because you find that when someone is suffering in this way, they actually have high amounts of sugar that is in their urine. And what was actually discovered originally when sort of doctors were looking at that is if you were giving people lots of white sugar, they were actually able to reverse this. In terms of when you're then producing or giving the body lots of white sugar, they were then able to prevent that sugar in the urine from being kind of coming out through the body. These people then started to put on weight again because they were normally in a very low weight state because they just weren't able to produce energy and they're in such a catabolic state. And so giving these people white sugar was actually the thing that helped repair them. And I'm not saying that this is what everyone needs to do and that this is the kind of one-size-fits-all solution, but I think it kind of flies in the face of what we think about sugar in terms of diabetes and insulin resistance, and that it's all sugar's fault, which is definitely not the case. And look, can refined foods cause a problem? Of course they can, but I don't think it's the sugar per se. It's normally that these foods have kind of less vitamins and less minerals in them. And these vitamins and minerals are needed for sort of proper energy metabolism. So it's not just about insulin getting that sugar into the cells. It's like certain vitamins and minerals are then needed as part of the different stages to then create ATP. And so when you get into a situation where someone's making the kind of main components of their diet be one that's really all about sort of refined foods, over time they're going to become deficient in things, and this is then going to cause a problem and can lead them down the path to getting sort of insulin resistance or diabetes. But when I think about it, like the real issue with this stuff is it's what I kind of think about as an opportunity cost. And that is that the more of these kind of foods and refined foods that people have, the more that they're then missing out on the opportunity to eat more nutritious foods. And that if you're eating a diet that's largely consisting then of sort of whole foods that you can easily digest and assimilate, including some processed foods in your diet is going to have a pretty negligible effect. Because I don't think that this stuff is inherently bad. It becomes a problem when it starts accounting for more and more of what someone eats. And am I saying that this food is perfect and that there's no issues with it? Of course I'm not. But I think people need to get away from the idea that this food is just like poison or the devil or any of those kind of really negative connotations, and that any time that they eat that food, they're causing themselves a problem, because it's definitely not the case. And with that said, depending on the situation, some processed foods can be very helpful and very useful with helping to reverse this situation. If someone is suffering from problems relating to energy metabolism, and this is causing them to have high blood sugars and have issues in that way, and this is because they've been sort of under-eating, whether that be intentionally or unintentionally, foods that are more processed can be, in certain situations, easier for them to digest and assimilate. And often people who've been sort of under-eating can have a real suppressed appetite. And I know this can be quite surprising for people, and everyone's like, to keep to a 1,200 calorie a day diet, someone's got to be using sort of lots of willpower and lots of force. But actually what I find is for some people over time, they really lose their appetite. And to then be able to get in the calories they need can be really difficult. So to start out with, having them eating more processed foods or having things more kind of highly palatable can actually work wonders for them. So this isn't the solution forever, but in the short term, it can help them to bring in more energy. And as they're bringing in more energy and things are starting to work, their appetite starts to come up, their digestion starts to increase, and they're able to then transition over to having sort of more whole foods and more unprocessed foods, because they can then make the most of these things then being in their diet. So I think that unfortunately sort of a lot of the sort of nutrition sort of sound bites that people spout out, like sugar causes diabetes or that processed food should be sort of avoided at all costs for anyone who's got insulin resistance, it's just not true. And it really depends on the situation and what's going on. So if I'm to then look at sort of what should someone be doing if they think they've got high blood sugars or they've got insulin resistance or they're heading towards diabetes or they have diabetes, for me, the first would be kind of looking at providing the body with sort of adequate carbohydrates. And I know this kind of flies in the face of what most people say in terms of that you should be avoiding carbohydrates. But really, avoiding carbohydrates is just a band-aid to the solution. It's not really dealing with the root cause. The high blood sugar is not the issue. The issue is that the cells aren't able to produce adequate energy and aren't able to use the energy that's coming in to actually create ATP. If you look at sort of traditional cultures, they would eat sort of lots of things like tubers and white rice and high GI foods as part of their staple diets, and they weren't plagued with insulin resistance and diabetes. So if this was the real cause, these sort of high GI foods, these people would have been in a lot more trouble, but they're not. So blood sugar is important, but you want someone to be able to regulate their blood sugar while eating sort of carb-rich meals, and to be able to eat a carb-rich meal and then get their blood sugar down to a normal level shortly afterwards. Like keeping carbs under 50 grams a day and then having someone have good blood sugar really demonstrates nothing. But worse than this, it then cuts off their cells' preferential energy supply, which is carbohydrates. So having someone taking adequate carbohydrates, I think, is one of the first things they need to be doing. And it might be someone has to kind of slowly build up to this if they've been sort of avoiding that stuff to start with. But it should be part of their diet. And I'd say as part of that, sort of having things that have both good amounts of glucose and fructose. And fructose and glucose are different kinds of sugars. And for a lot of the kind of bad press around sugar, a lot of it gets blamed on fructose, as if fructose is the thing that causes the problem. But actually, it's not true. And fructose is very important for helping the body to restore liver glycogen. And so glycogen is a form of sugar that you use between meals or in times of emergency. So when you eat a meal, you then use that energy to start with. And once that energy then runs out, you then start to use the thing called glycogen. And once your glycogen runs out, then you start to be having to break down and cannibalize your body to then continue on unless you have another meal. And so glycogen is then really important for supporting people between meals. And what I find and what's been kind of shown in research is when people are under stress, they're not able to store glycogen properly. And this means that when someone runs out of energy between their meals, they don't have anything else to fall back on. They don't have those reserves. And so they're instantly having to kind of turn on that stress response. And so the benefit of fructose is it helps to kind of restore and build up the reserves of glycogen. It also helps cells to be able to produce carbon dioxide, which, as I kind of said before, is just so important for how cells can function and for energy production. So having high amounts of carbon dioxide is really important. I would also add sort of having someone eat as frequently as they need to and kind of being aware of meal timings. And look, for some people in the beginning, this might be that they have to have something every 2 hours or 2.5 hours. For other people, it might be every 4 hours. And it might be that they have to eat more frequently in the morning and they can get away with more in the afternoon or the evening or vice versa. But the goal with eating regularity is that you need to be eating or you want to be eating often enough so that your body isn't having to turn on that stress response. So you're using the energy, you're then using glycogen, or you're not using glycogen, you're eating quickly enough so that you're not having to then turn on that stress response. Because when you're turning on that stress response, it's then kind of breaking down the body, it's kind of driving up those blood sugars, it's then creating this whole cascade of negative impact. So what I find is with time, people can then go longer between their meals because they've got more glycogen being stored. They've got more reserves. They're typically able to eat bigger meals. They're able to digest it better, so they're able to get more out of it. So with time, people can start to have bigger gaps between their meals, but they still need to be eating as often as they need to. And I think that it shouldn't be this kind of goal of I need to get to 3 meals a day and that's going to be my eating schedule. For some people, that just isn't a reality and they're just never going to get there just because of the way their body functions. And so eat in the way that best serves your body, not necessarily that best serves what you want it to do. As part of your meals, I'd say be having sort of complete meals that have carbs, proteins, and fats. So not be having a meal that's just got huge amounts of carbohydrates, but no protein or fat. So just having a meal where you're having tons of fruit on its own might not be such a great idea. Having a meal where you have a huge amount of meat and then just have some salad with it is probably not a great idea either, because you're then missing out on the carbs. So having a meal that has carb, protein, and fat for your meals and snacks is also really important. Managing stress. And I know this sounds incredibly vague because it depends on where someone's stress is coming from, what's that stressor about. But if you can be kind of looking at the mental emotional side of stress and kind of dealing with those things, but definitely kind of focusing on the physiological side of stress. And so, as I said, stress is about finding energy to mediate a situation when the body is in that state. And so doing things that are keeping you out of that state as much as possible. And alongside that, I'd be looking at things like getting proper sleep, getting sunshine, doing things to help in terms of circadian rhythm. And like sleep is where your body's doing most of its repair work. So if you're trying to heal the body, getting adequate sleep at the right times is incredibly important. And it's a topic that is really a big passion of mine, like sleep. I think people very much undervalue sleep and how important it is for the body, and like really it should be people's priorities. And it's a topic I'm definitely going to do a future podcast on and just go into some real details about it. In terms of sort of sunshine, I mean, our cells produce energy in the presence of sunlight. And I know that sounds kind of hippie-ish and woo-woo and all of that, but it's really true. When sunlight gets into the body, it then hits into our cells, and that can help our cells to produce energy. And it's not all sunlight, it's specifically sunlight that are in the sort of UV rays of sort of red or near infrared. But that type of light helps our cells to produce energy more effectively. So getting people to be outdoors and getting them to be getting light into their life is then really important as part of this. Circadian rhythm, as I said, I mean, it is the 24-hour body clock, or the cycle that goes on within your body over a day in terms of hormones being high and hormones being low and certain functions happening and certain functions being turned off. And having proper circadian rhythm working correctly is just so important. And if this is out, it means that you're not going to be able to sleep properly and you're not getting the kind of repair that should go on. You're more likely to be craving foods that are probably not so good for you. So craving more of those processed foods. It affects how much you want to move, kind of what hormones are high and low at certain times of the day. And I really think that sort of dysregulation in people's circadian rhythm is a real kind of silent epidemic. And it's probably part of the reason why people have got so many issues and why things like diabetes or insulin resistance is becoming so much of a problem today. So kind of doing things that are helping in terms of circadian rhythm. Spending more time moving and not sitting. I mean, there's just so much evidence now around the problems with prolonged sitting. And so getting people not only to be kind of doing exercise in terms of going for runs or lifting weights or those sort of things, but just moving their body more often, not spending so much time sitting. So doing more of your work standing up, or making sure you're getting out and doing regular walks and not having long periods where you're just sitting the whole time is going to definitely have an impact in terms of insulin sensitivity and how your cells can produce energy. And then kind of the final one would be sort of just looking at the oils you have coming into your diet. And there's a lot of research showing that sort of polyunsaturated oils can have a real negative impact on the way that your cells can produce energy. And so this is largely things like vegetable oils, but it can also include things like nuts and seeds and fish oils. And I know that these are normally sort of the ultimate health foods that nutritionists are recommending people have. And polyunsaturated oils, they can have their uses, and they do have their uses, and they are totally impossible to avoid. But I think people need to be not having them in the kinds of quantities that they're eating them in, and people having kind of huge handfuls of nuts and seeds on a daily basis, and people taking kind of mega doses of fish oils, I think actually is going to cause problems. And these sort of oils kind of lead to more inflammation. They sort of negatively impact on your cell's ability to function and produce energy. They can impair thyroid function, and your thyroid is just so crucial for how well your cells can produce energy. So this further impairs energy production. So typically from the sort of the oil side of things, or the fat side of things, going from more of the sort of saturated fats and the monounsaturated fats. And this doesn't mean you need to be going crazy on this stuff. You don't need to be sort of eating butter and coconut oil by the ladleful, or kind of putting into coffee, as some people are suggesting. Use these oils kind of very normally as part of your cooking and eating, but just be going for having more of the kind of saturated and monounsaturated fats as opposed to the polyunsaturated fats. So these are the things I'd say that you would most want to focus on. And I know they're kind of bigger picture and sort of general ideas, and how this then specifically works for someone's life will be kind of very nuanced for kind of that person. And through sort of trying things out and listening to their body, they can work out what works for them. And I just want to kind of finish off with saying a lot of my thoughts about sort of carbohydrates and insulin resistance and diabetes and all that have kind of been influenced by a number of people, and these are people that you might want to check out if you want to find out more about this. And Matt Stone was probably the first person that brought this stuff to my attention, probably sort of 4 or 5 years ago, and he's kind of written a lot on this. Ray Peat is someone who's talked a lot about this, and a lot of kind of very, very detailed, and he's definitely not the easiest person to read if you're kind of a lay person. There's some people who've kind of written about his stance on things. So people like Josh and Jeannie Rubin, Danny Roddy. I mean, Danny is someone who I really like, and he's got a really great style. He can write a lot about sort of what Ray Peat talks about, but just makes it much easier to kind of digest and understand. And probably more recently, someone like Ari Whitten. He released a book last year called The Low-Carb Myth. So much of it I knew about. There was stuff that I didn't know about, but it's just got so much invaluable information all in one place. And some of what I've mentioned today is things that I got from his book, and some of them are from other sources like Danny. And I'd add, like, in my next podcast, I actually have Ari Whitten on here. So I think you're going to really like what he has to say. It's a really great interview. He shares some sort of real fantastic insights. So yeah, definitely check that one out. So that's it for today. I hope this has given you a bit of a better understanding on blood sugar. I know that some of it was a little bit technical, but I just want people to start to understand that when people are having issues around insulin resistance or diabetes or that side of things, like, the blood sugar is not the issue. It's a symptom of what's going on. Getting the cell to function properly and produce energy effectively, that's the real problem, and that's where people really need to be focusing on and trying to repair. So that's it for today's show, and I will catch you next week.
Thanks for listening to Real Health Radio. If you are interested in more details, you can find them at the 7 Health website. That's www.7health.com.